So the first thing we did, the most noticeable thing, is we broke each chapter into modules. So as you can see here, chapter 1 has 3 modules. And so we broke down the chapter. We, in many cases, kept the order the same, but we came up with modules, discrete units to break down the chapters, which we heard from teachers makes it so much easier to assign, oh, read module 1 for tonight, rather than having to say, read chapter 1, pages 1 through 17, or something like that. So that was one of the things. Next slide. I'm sorry, Nicole, back up. I thought I had one in there, but maybe I didn't. We also put in a lot of new chapter openers. So to frack or not to frack is the chapter opener in chapter 1, and that's new. And there's 5 or 6 new out of 20 chapter openers. So there's about a quarter of them or more that are new. Next slide, please. We put learning objectives, and we said that after reading each module, you should be able to do certain things. Explain why water is an important component of most environmental systems, for example. Next slide. We put a marginal glossary, so it's right there at the bottom of each page. Any new words that have shown up on that page are highlighted and defined right there. And then they're in the glossary at the end of the book as well. Next, we put more critical thinking questions. We heard from a lot of teachers that critical thinking questions that are almost prefaces or beginnings to free response questions, get more of those in there. So for example, working towards sustainability, a feature at the end of each chapter from our first edition didn't have critical thinking questions. Now it does. Next slide, please. We did more AP review. We heard from people that that's what they wanted. So each module has AP questions. The end of each chapter has a practice exam. There are 8 units in the book corresponding to the ACORN book, the College Board ACORN book, 8 different units within the environmental science curriculum. And we have a practice exam for each unit. And then furthermore, we have one cumulative exam at the end of the book that has 100 multiple choice questions and free response questions. So truly almost like a practice AP exam. So we put all that in there. Next slide. And we also said, well, that's okay for a student edition, but we're going to come up with a teacher's edition as well. And we have an annotated teacher's edition that's going to be out in late spring, so maybe just a month or so from now. And it has a lot of other things around it. As this page shows, we have a pacing guide for each chapter. We have alignment to AP Environmental Science course description, so it shows you where the material in your course is related to the curriculum. We also have free response questions from previous AP Environmental Science exams, so it tells you in a given chapter how many questions and what were the nature of the questions that came up about that material. So those are just some of the things we did. Next slide. Here's an example where for free response questions from previous AP exams, we said, well, in 1999, there was a question on the scientific method. In 2003, there was a question on the scientific method, and so on. So we did those kinds of things. Next slide. So as you can see, the book itself, the student edition of the book, is a small part of the page, and there's a wraparound margin with teaching tips, answers to do the math questions, other teaching tips, more math practice. So there's all kinds of things going on every page. So we're really excited about this teacher's edition, which will be coming out very soon. Next, please. So what we advertise and what we want to talk about for a little while is making problem solving easier for your students and maybe perhaps for you, because I find that even for me, sometimes I just don't want to dive into some of these problems that you have to do. They sometimes hurt your brain to dive in and get to them. So I have found, and I'm sure you have found similar things, that finding stories that your students care about, it helps a lot. Things that are ripped from the headlines about an oil spill or an oil tanker accident or a freight train carrying oil that has had an accident is sometimes useful. Another thing that I find very useful is using data from their daily lives. Those are all things that I find make problem solving easier. The former chief reader of AP Environmental Science stated one year in a public session at the AP annual conference that fluency with numerical manipulation was essential to success on the AP environmental science exam. What he said is if your student knew all the material in the course but wasn't particularly fluent at numerical manipulation, at doing some math, about taking some information and multiplying or dividing, that person would at best get a 4 on the AP exam. Those were his words. Those aren't mine. But he made the point that you really have to have that. So I tell that to people, and I say that it's great to understand the concepts and to know some facts, but it's also really important to take information and do something with it. And that's important in the course, but I think it's also important in the world. It's important when you're a citizen in the world and you're just trying to decide what's the right thing to do for myself, or maybe for your town or your city or your university or your high school or whatever it might be. So I just threw in that one little source for converting units because one of the headaches gets to be converting units. And there are lots of sources, and I'm sure you have others that you use. Next slide, please. So here's an example. Which contains more energy? The fuel usage for a car for 1 year, 400 gallons of gasoline, or the electricity used to power, and I'm not sure I like that, the electricity used to supply an average U.S. home with electricity for 1 year, 8,000 kilowatt hours. So which one of those is more? One of the hard things with environmental science is your units aren't always the same. And in this case, which one is bigger? And you might not know right away. Next slide. So first of all, how do we get 400 gallons? A person who owns an automobile and travels 25 miles using 1 gallon of gasoline, we say that car gets 25 miles per gallon. If they travel 10,000 miles per year, which is about an average that the EPA, I think the EPA actually says 12,000 miles per year is what a typical car travels, but let's just say 10,000. And if the car gets 25 miles per gallon, then dividing out, that car uses 400 gallons in a year. So that's where I got that number from in the previous slide. Next slide, please. And if we know that a gallon of gasoline is the energy equivalent of 132 megajoules of energy content, that is not talking about how efficiently we've converted it, but if we could, in an ideal world, get all the energy out of that gasoline, we get 132 megajoules, then 400 gallons times 132 megajoules per gallon would give us 52,800 megajoules of energy content in that 400 gallons of gasoline. And my apologies, the M in the third line, it should be a capital M. There's no reason why that M is lowercase and the others are uppercase. But at any rate, you see what we did. We just took the 400 gallons of gasoline and we converted it to another kind of unit, megajoules of energy content, because ultimately we want to compare it to how many megajoules are there in the electricity that we used in a year. Next slide, please. But I need to take a little distraction here. I'm sorry, you know, we have a little time, right? And I just wanted to show you some other things you could do. So maybe you or your class has taken a class trip, have done some air travel, and you might ask yourself, well, how does aviation, commercial aviation, compare to automobiles? And in fact, a typical commercial transcontinental jet might get 40 passenger miles per gallon of jet fuel. So that is, we just talked about a car that was 25 miles per gallon if one person is in the car. And here, for each person in an airplane, it's about 40 passenger miles per gallon of jet fuel. So a person going from New York to Los Angeles, it's about 5,000 miles round trip. And at 40 passenger miles per gallon, that means that one trip uses 125 gallons per person. That one round trip uses 125 gallons. And so if we convert that to megajoules, aviation fuel is approximately the energy content of gasoline. It's not exact, but we can use the same number, 132 megajoules per gallon. And what we can do is we can say that there's 16,500 megajoules being used to do that round trip.